The food was there. That's the part that keeps historians up at night, the detail that refuses to sit quietly in any honest account of the worst famines in recorded history. The food existed. It grew in the fields. It sat in the warehouses. It moved along the roads and down the rivers and across the oceans. And the people it should have fed were lying face down in ditches, their lips green from eating grass, their children silent in ways that children should never be silent. During the Great Famine in Ireland, ships loaded with grain, livestock, and butter sailed out of Irish ports every single week, while 1 million people starved to death on the island those ships were leaving behind. During the worst years of Soviet collectivization, Ukraine, the breadbasket of an entire empire, the land so fertile they called the soil black gold, was shipping grain to foreign markets, while its villages were filling with corpses. During the Bengal famine of 1943, British India exported rice, while the streets of Calcutta were so thick with the dying that city workers ran out of places to put the bodies. During Mao's Great Leap Forward, granaries across China sat locked and full, while somewhere between 15 and 55 million people starved to death. The uncertainty of that number, that enormous spread between estimates, is its own kind of violence. This is the story that nobody who controls food wants you to know. Famine is almost never a natural disaster. It is almost always a political decision, or a series of political decisions, about who gets to eat and who doesn't, about which lives the state considers worth saving and which ones it considers expendable, about how hunger, when you control it carefully enough, can break a people, reshape a nation, crush a rebellion, or move an economy. The mechanisms are different across every case we're going to examine. The justifications are different. The ideologies are completely different. What doesn't change is the logic underneath. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. In the news headlines right now, in the debates about food security and government power that are happening in this country today, in the story of how your own family, if you have Irish blood anywhere in your tree, ended up in America instead of in the green fields your great-great-grandmother was forced to leave forever. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning of a pattern that runs through the 19th and 20th centuries like a dark thread, and let's follow it to where it leads. Before we get into it, if this kind of story is what you came here for, the kind that pulls the curtain back on things you were never quite taught in school, hit subscribe right now and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing where in the world these stories are landing. And if you make it to the end of this one, leave a comment with the word grain. I'll know you stayed for the whole thing. Now, Ireland, 1845. The potato blight arrived quietly, the way catastrophes often do. One morning, a farmer in County Cork walked out to his field and noticed the smell. Not a dramatic smell, not the sulfurous explosion you'd expect from the opening of a disaster, but something low and sweet and wrong, like rot just beginning underneath something that still looked whole on the surface. He dug up a potato. It was black inside. He dug up another one, black. He walked the length of his field, pulling plants out of the ground, and every single one of them was collapsing from within, turning into wet gray mush in his hands. Within weeks, that smell was everywhere in Ireland. It rose from fields across the entire island, this sweet rot that meant a people's entire food supply was failing all at once. Now here's what you need to understand about why the potato failure hit Ireland the way it did. Ireland in the 1840s was a colony, fully, completely, structurally a colony of the British Empire. And like most colonies, it had been organized not for the benefit of the people living there, but for the extraction of wealth flowing outward to the colonizing power. Irish land was owned almost entirely by British landlords, many of whom had never set foot on Irish soil and never intended to. The Irish peasantry rented tiny plots of land from these absentee owners and paid their rent by growing cash crops, grain, livestock, butter, oats, that were shipped directly to England. The only thing they were allowed to keep for themselves, The only crop that could grow enough food on a small enough piece of land to feed a family was the potato. So when the blight came, the Irish peasants lost everything. Not just their food, their entire margin of survival. The cash crops kept growing, the grain kept being harvested, the livestock kept fattening in their pens. Every week, through the worst years of the famine, ships left Irish ports loaded with that food and sailed to England. Think about what that means for a moment. A man could stand on the docks at Cork or Waterford or Drogheda and watch a ship being loaded with Irish oats and Irish barley and Irish cattle, food that could have fed his starving children, and there was nothing he could do about it, because that food belonged not to Ireland, but to the structure of empire that had claimed Ireland as its property. William Bennett, a Quaker who traveled through the west of Ireland in 1847 and recorded what he saw, wrote this: "We visited over 50 tenants. Everywhere the same picture, the only difference being the number of sufferers. They rarely complained. When asked, they answered only, 'Ta okrasorum,' I am hungry." We came to understand the true meaning of that sad word, okras. The British government's response to the famine was shaped by a philosophy called laissez-faire, the idea that markets should regulate themselves, that government intervention in the economy was both inefficient and morally wrong. The political economists advising London's treasury genuinely believed that if the Irish were starving, the correct response was to let market forces solve the problem, rather than disrupt trade by, say, stopping food exports or flooding the island with relief supplies. One senior treasury official, Charles Trevelyan, who oversaw Britain's famine relief policy, wrote that the famine was the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people. He meant it. That belief, that the Irish poor were poor because of some fundamental moral deficiency, not because of the colonial structure that had stripped them of their land and their resources, shaped every decision the British government made during those years. Public works programs were organized. Starving people were put to work building roads that often led nowhere, roads built for the sake of building them, so that the government could feel it was doing something without actually interfering with the market. The wages were so low that workers frequently collapsed and died on the road sites from a combination of starvation and exhaustion. Soup kitchens were eventually opened, run by private charities and Quaker relief organizations that worked themselves into the ground, trying to feed millions of people with resources meant for thousands. Through all of it, through every soup kitchen and every public works scheme and every emergency debate in the House of Commons, the food exports continued. A figure worth sitting with. In the first 9 months of 1847, the worst single year of the famine, the year the dying peaked, ships carried out of Ireland enough food to feed every single starving person on the island. The ships went out full. The roads were lined with bodies. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the people in London who were making the decisions knew both of those things were true. By 1851, when the worst was over, Ireland had lost somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of its entire population. 1 million people were dead. Another 1.5 million had emigrated, most of them to the United States, crammed into vessels so overcrowded and so poorly provisioned that the ships themselves were called coffin ships, because a significant portion of the people who boarded them never made it to the other side of the Atlantic. The Irish-American community that exists today, the largest ethnic diaspora in American history, exists because of those years. Every American with an Irish last name, every St. Patrick's Day parade, every Irish pub from Boston to San Francisco, every Kennedy and Reagan and Biden, all of that traces back to those ships leaving Cork Harbor with their bellies full of grain, while the land behind them was full of the dead. Most British historians and many mainstream accounts frame the Irish famine as a tragedy of ideology. Well-meaning officials who were wrong about economics, who clung to a bad philosophy at the worst possible moment, and let a disaster unfold that they could have prevented. A different reading, one that Irish historians have pushed with increasing force, says that what happened in Ireland between 1845 and 1851 meets the definition of a man-made catastrophe so complete, so systematic, and so ruthlessly maintained against all evidence and all human appeal that it has to be understood as something more deliberate than incompetence. The British Parliament, after all, had the power to stop the food exports with a single vote. They never took that vote. That question, the line between catastrophic negligence and deliberate use of starvation as a tool of colonial control, runs through every case we're going to examine in this story. By the time we reach the end of it, you'll have enough pieces to form your own answer. Right now, let's travel forward in time. Let's move from the green fields of 19th century Ireland to the vast black earth plains of Soviet Ukraine, where something even more deliberately engineered was about to begin, and where the tools being used to manage hunger had grown considerably more sophisticated. The year is 1932. The Soviet Union is in the middle of one of the most radical social transformations any government has ever attempted in peacetime: the forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin's plan was simple in its ambition and staggering in its brutality. Take the land that Russian and Ukrainian and Kazakh peasants had farmed for generations, pull it out of their hands, and reorganize it into collective farms controlled by the state. This would, in theory, modernize Soviet agriculture, generate grain surpluses that could be sold abroad to fund industrialization, and fundamentally restructure rural life along socialist lines. The peasants who resisted, labeled kulaks, meaning wealthy farmers, though the definition was stretched to cover almost anyone who pushed back, were cast as class enemies, standing in the way of historical progress. The peasants resisted. Of course they resisted. A Ukrainian farmer who had worked the same land his father worked and his grandfather worked before that, who understood every dip and rise of those fields, who knew which corners flooded in spring and which ones drained fast, did not want to hand that land over to a collective farm managed by a party official from the city who had never planted a seed in his life. They resisted passively, by slowing down, by hiding grain, by slaughtering their own livestock rather than handing it over to the collective. They resisted actively, in some places with open confrontation. The Soviet state's response was to treat agricultural failure as sabotage, treat peasant resistance as counter-revolutionary conspiracy, and treat the collection of grain quotas as a military operation. It's worth understanding the pressure that Soviet planners were operating under. They were trying to transform an overwhelmingly agricultural country into an industrial power within a generation, racing against what they perceived as an existential threat from hostile capitalist nations. The collectivization drive was brutal, yes, but it was driven by a specific ideological logic, the belief that only total state control of agriculture could generate the surpluses needed to fund the industrialization that would save the revolution. That logic does not excuse what followed, but it explains why people inside the system genuinely believed they were doing something necessary. Brigades of party activists and security forces went into Ukrainian villages with long metal-tipped wooden rods, they called them probes, and used them to search every house, every barn, every earthen floor for hidden grain. They pried up floorboards, they tapped walls listening for hollow spaces, they emptied bread boxes and lifted mattresses and reached into the straw of thatched roofs, pulling out anything that looked like it might be food. If they found hidden grain, the family was labeled a saboteur, their remaining food was confiscated entirely, and they were often arrested or deported. If they found nothing, they sometimes took what little remained in the cooking pot anyway, because the quota had to be met. Villages that failed to meet their grain quotas were placed on something called the black list, chorny doshki in Ukrainian, the black boards. A village on the blacklist was cut off. No food could be brought in from outside. No resident could leave to look for food elsewhere. The village was ringed by officials who turned back anyone trying to get out. The grain quotas continued to be collected from whatever was left. At the peak of the famine in the spring of 1933, the death rate in Ukraine reached a scale almost impossible to hold in the human mind. Estimates suggest tens of thousands dying every single day across the affected regions. Not in a war zone, not in the middle of a plague that no one could control, in a country that was simultaneously exporting grain. Katerina was a woman in a village in Poltava region, We don't know her last name because her last name wasn't recorded. We know about her because a neighbor survived and testified decades later. Katharina had 4 children. By February of 1933, 2 of them were already dead. She was keeping the other 2 alive by boiling leather straps from old harnesses and feeding them the broth. When the brigade came to her house and found a small sack of millet she had hidden in the wall, perhaps 3 or 4 pounds of grain, they took it, all of it. She stood in the doorway of her house watching them carry it away, and she said nothing because there was nothing left to say. By April, Katharina and her remaining children were gone. The neighbor who testified about her had survived because she had eaten bark. Historians have spent decades arguing about how intentional all of this was, and this is one of the genuine, unresolved debates of 20th century history, not a political talking point, but an actual scholarly controversy. Some researchers, particularly those working from Soviet archives, argue that the famine was the catastrophic but unintended result of ideologically driven collectivization policies pushed too hard and too fast. That Soviet leadership was criminally reckless and criminally indifferent to the suffering it caused, but that mass death was not the intended outcome. The party, in this reading, was trying to build something and broke everything in the process. Other historians, and this view has gained significant ground, reflected in the fact that over 30 countries have now formally recognized the Holodomor as a distinct tragedy requiring acknowledgement, argue that the specific measures taken in Ukraine in late 1932 and early 1933, particularly the blacklist system and the restrictions on movement, represent a level of deliberate engineering that goes beyond recklessness. What is not disputed is this: the Soviet government knew people were dying in enormous numbers. Its own officials were sending desperate reports from Ukraine. The security apparatus was filing detailed casualty counts from every region. The response to that knowledge was to maintain the quotas, maintain the blacklists, maintain the restrictions on movement, and maintain the information controls that kept the outside world from understanding what was happening. International aid offers were refused. Western journalists who tried to report on the famine were denied access or pressured to file favorable stories. The official position, maintained for decades, was that no famine had occurred. That machinery, the bureaucratic apparatus that turned starvation into policy, didn't appear out of nowhere. It had a history. It had precedents. Understanding how it was built, piece by piece, is what explains how the same logic could repeat itself on the other side of the world just a decade later, with different flags, different slogans, and the same locked granaries. A document sits in the Soviet state archives, catalogued, stamped, filed alongside hundreds of documents exactly like it, that lists, in neat columns, the grain requisition figures for a collective farm in Kharkiv region for the month of November 1932. The document is typed, the columns are aligned. Someone corrected an arithmetic error in the 3rd column with a single neat strike-through and a handwritten correction above it. At the bottom, a signature and a stamp. The village that document describes had, by that point, already run out of food. The people who lived there were eating cats. The quota in that document, the neat, corrected, stamped, signed quota, was for several hundred pounds of grain that the village no longer had. This is what the bureaucratic face of starvation looks like. Not screaming, not chaos, paperwork. The Soviet collectivization system generated documentation the way a factory generates product. Requisition orders flowed down from Moscow to regional party offices, from regional offices to district offices, from district offices to the brigades on the ground. Each level was responsible for extracting a quota from the level below. Each level was also responsible for reporting its results upward. Because every official in that chain knew that failing to meet quota could mean demotion, arrest, or worse, the reports flowing upward had a powerful structural incentive to show success, or, at minimum, to show effort. The brigades on the ground reported what they took. The district offices reported what the brigades gave them. The regional offices compiled totals and sent them to Moscow. Moscow looked at the totals and decided whether the quotas needed to go higher. The people dying in the villages between all those layers of paperwork were, in the most literal administrative sense, invisible. They appeared nowhere in the chain of reporting. No column existed for them. What existed, instead, was a railway schedule. The Soviet grain export system ran on rails, and the rails ran on time. Grain collected from Ukrainian collective farms was transported by horse-drawn cart to the nearest collection point, usually a state granary or a rail depot, where it was weighed, recorded, and loaded into freight cars. The freight cars moved west and north through a network of rail lines to the major export points: Odessa on the Black Sea, Nikolaev, Kherson. From those ports, the grain went onto ships. The ships went to Germany, to Italy, to Britain, to Turkey, to the foreign markets where Soviet grain was sold for hard currency that would fund the purchase of industrial machinery. The railway schedules for 1932 and 1933 have been preserved. They show a transport system operating continuously and systematically throughout the famine period. The trains ran, the grain moved, the ships loaded, the exports continued. At the same time those railway schedules were being followed, the security apparatus maintained a parallel reporting system that tracked, among other things, what it described as unusual mortality in rural areas. These reports used careful language. They spoke of elementary dystrophy, the clinical term for starvation, and increased morbidity and population decline in affected districts. The language was precise and bloodless, and it described, in aggregate, a catastrophe of nearly incomprehensible scale. The reports went to Stalin's desk. His notations survive on some of them. He read them. The trains kept running. A particular kind of dread lives in understanding a system well enough to see how each of its parts was rational in isolation. The official who signed the requisition form was doing his job. The official who compiled the district totals was doing his job. The railway administrator who maintained the export schedule was doing his job. The security officer who filed the mortality report was doing his job. No single person in the chain had to decide to starve anyone. The decision was architectural, built into the structure itself, distributed across thousands of individual acts of compliance, each one defensible on its own terms. That is what makes it so difficult to look at directly. A monster you can name, a system you can only describe. The system had a sound, metal couplings clicking as freight cars were hooked together in the pre-dawn darkness at a grain depot outside the Dnipropetrovsk, shovels scraping grain into weighing bins, a stamp coming down on another requisition form in another district office where the stove was warm and bread sat on the desk. These sounds continued, regular and mechanical and utterly indifferent, while the sound of the countryside around them changed, grew quieter, then grew almost silent. A schoolteacher named Mikola, whose written account survived in fragments, described walking through his village in January of 1933. He wrote, "I passed 12 houses. In 3 of them I heard nothing at all, no sound of any kind, no movement. In 2 of them there were sounds I cannot describe and will not try to. In the others, silence of a particular kind, the silence of people still alive, but no longer speaking." He described, almost without transition, the sight of a loaded grain cart moving down the road at the edge of the village. He didn't comment on the juxtaposition. He didn't need to. The cart was going to the depot was going to the railway was going to Odessa was going to the world market, where Soviet grain was priced competitively and where buyers from a dozen nations were placing orders because Soviet grain was cheap and the harvest, officially, had been good. Now, stretch your mind from the Ukrainian steppe to something that might seem, at first glance, completely different. A different continent, a different war, a different empire, a different ideology. Bengal, India, 1943. What happened there throws the logic of structured hunger into a different light entirely. A light that is, in some ways, even more clarifying, because in Bengal, someone actually wrote the equation down. Winston Churchill's War Cabinet,
trying to manage the enormous logistical demands of fighting a global war on multiple fronts, made a series of decisions about food supply in British India that its own officials warned, in writing, would cause mass death. The decisions were made anyway. What followed was a famine that killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people in Bengal in a single year. The mechanism worked like this. Bengal in 1943 was under enormous pressure from the Japanese advance through Southeast Asia. Burma had fallen. The fear of Japanese invasion of India was real and urgent, and the British military response included a scorched earth policy in coastal Bengal. Boats were confiscated or destroyed to prevent the Japanese from using them. Rice stocks in vulnerable areas were removed and not replaced. Transport animals were requisitioned for military use. The logic was military: deny resources to a potential invader. The effect was to strip coastal Bengal's rural population of both its food supply and its ability to move food around.
At the same time, Bengal was experiencing a significant inflation spiral, driven by wartime spending. Food prices were rising faster than poor people could track. Rice, the staple food of Bengali peasants, went from affordable to simply beyond reach within the span of a few months. Families that had fed themselves adequately the year before found themselves unable to buy enough to eat, not because the food was gone, but because the price had moved beyond their wages. The food was there. Unlike Ireland and unlike Ukraine, Bengal in 1943 was not experiencing a crop failure of any serious magnitude. The rice harvest of that year was slightly below average, but not catastrophically so. The famine was not caused by a shortfall in production. The economist Amartya Sen, who was a child in Bengal during the famine and later built his career partly around understanding what happened there, described what occurred as an entitlement failure, the collapse of a population's ability to access food that physically existed. Churchill's war cabinet received reports from India's viceroy and from his own ministers, warning that the food situation in Bengal was deteriorating into catastrophe. The cabinet's response was to reduce food imports to India and prioritize the building of stockpiles in Britain and in other theaters of the war. Stockpiles intended as a buffer against future shortages in Europe and the Middle East. India's needs were weighed against Britain's strategic calculations and found to be secondary. One official suggested, in a memo that has been preserved, that the Bengal situation was self-limiting, meaning that as the population declined, demand for food would fall and prices would stabilize. He was describing the death of millions as a market correction. Churchill's own attitude toward Indian suffering was not a secret to his contemporaries. His private statements about Indians ranged from dismissive to contemptuous. When the Indian government sent urgent requests for food imports to alleviate the Bengal famine, Churchill asked, with genuine irritation, why Gandhi hadn't died yet. When a particularly desperate cable arrived describing the scale of the dying, he reportedly responded by asking why, if things were so bad, the Indian population kept increasing. These are not the words of a man who considered the lives in question fully human, in the way he considered British lives human. That dehumanization, the philosophical architecture that makes it possible to look at a mortality report and see a data point rather than a person, is the secret engine of every case we're examining. It doesn't require a monster at the controls. It requires something more modest and more durable, a framework in which the dying population is categorized as something other than fully deserving of the moral consideration being applied to everyone else. For British officials managing Ireland, the Irish peasant was indolent and unself-reliant, and his suffering was the market's judgment on his inadequacy. For those enforcing Soviet collectivization, the resistant peasant was a class enemy, a saboteur of historical progress, whose suffering was the inevitable friction of transformation, rather than the result of deliberate extraction. For Churchill's war cabinet managing Bengal, the Indian subject was a member of a subordinate population whose welfare was instrumentally relevant only insofar as it served imperial strategic interests. Different ideologies, different centuries, the same cognitive move. Constructing a category that places the people about to be allowed to starve outside the circle of full moral consideration. Once that category exists, everything that follows, the requisition orders, The export schedules, the reduced import quotas, the locked granaries, becomes a practical decision rather than a moral one. Practical decisions, as we've established, generate paperwork. Bengal generated paperwork too. Import requests, denied. Casualty estimates, received and filed. Price reports, noted and not acted on. And photographs. This is where Bengal 1943 becomes different from the other cases, because Bengal produced images, photographs taken by journalists and relief workers that showed what the system's logic looked like when it met actual human bodies on actual streets. Skeletons wrapped in skin walking through Calcutta. Mothers sitting in gutters with children who had already gone still. Dogs moving through the streets. Those photographs began to move through the world. Parts of it began to look. The photographs didn't stop the famine. The famine killed roughly 3 million people and was technically ended not by any policy reversal in London, but by the 1943 rice harvest arriving and stabilizing prices. The photographs did something that the requisition documents and the railway schedules and the security apparatus mortality reports had never done. They made the gap between the system's self-justification and its actual consequences visible to people who weren't supposed to see it. Something similar was happening in China at the same moment, and then again, a decade and a half later, on a scale that would dwarf everything we've examined so far. Because Mao Zedong, looking at the Soviet model of forced collectivization and reading its lessons carefully, built something that shared the same structural DNA as what we've just traced, but ran it faster and harder and more completely than anyone had managed before. The year is 1958. The great leap forward is beginning. The grain is moving again, toward the state, toward the cities, toward the export ledgers, while somewhere beneath the numbers, something the system has no column for, is already quietly starting. The first thing that changes is the sound of cooking. In a village in Anhui province in the winter of 1958, a woman named Chen, we know her only by that single syllable, recorded by a relief worker years later, noticed that her neighbors had stopped making the particular noise that came every evening through the thin walls of their houses, the scrape of a wok, the low percussion of something being chopped, the small domestic clatter of a family preparing to eat. Those sounds had been part of the texture of every evening of her life, as unremarkable and constant as wind. Then, one by one, they stopped. She didn't understand what it meant yet. None of them did. That's the thing about the early stages of a famine engineered at this scale. It doesn't announce itself. It withdraws. The sounds go first, then the smells, then the light in people's faces, which dims by such small degrees that you can't point to the day it changed. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward was, in its stated ambition, an attempt to transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial superpower within a handful of years, through the sheer organized force of collective human will. It was also, in its actual operation, the largest famine in recorded human history, a catastrophe so vast that the mathematics of it still resists comprehension, and so thoroughly buried under layers of state silence that the outside world didn't begin to understand its true scale until decades after the last body had been counted. The mechanism borrowed directly from the Soviet playbook: forced collectivization, state control of grain, centralized quota systems. But Mao's version had one crucial additional feature that made it distinctively, catastrophically worse. It had the commune system, the cadres, and the politics of reporting. Agricultural communes across China were organized under local party cadres, officials responsible for meeting production quotas set by higher levels of the party. Those quotas were based on harvest figures that were themselves wildly, deliberately inflated. During the early enthusiasm of the Great Leap, local cadres competed with each other to report the most spectacular production numbers, because spectacular numbers meant political favor, promotions, recognition. A cadre who reported that his commune had produced 10,000 pounds of grain per acre, an impossibility, several times beyond what the land could actually yield, was praised and rewarded. A cadre who reported accurately was suspected of sabotage or ideological weakness. The result was a cascading falsification that moved upward through every level of the bureaucracy. At the bottom, actual harvests. One level up, numbers 2 or 3 times larger. At the top, figures so fantastically disconnected from reality that the party leadership in Beijing genuinely believed, for a period, that China had solved its food problem permanently. Because the quotas were set against the inflated numbers rather than the real ones, the grain that was actually harvested was taken almost entirely, sometimes entirely, and sent to the cities or to the export ledgers, while the people who had grown it were left with whatever the cadre decided to leave behind, which was frequently almost nothing, and sometimes literally nothing at all. The cadres were caught in a trap of their own system's making. Admit the real numbers and face political destruction. Maintain the fiction and continue extracting grain from people who were already starving. Most of them maintained the fiction. Some of them, in the documented accounts that researchers painstakingly assembled from provincial archives decades later, continued to hold banquets, actual banquets, with multiple dishes and grain alcohol, in the commune headquarters, while the villages surrounding them were filling with bodies. Picture what that meant for a farmer in Sichuan, or Gansu, or Qinghai. He planted the seed. He worked the field through the summer. He brought in the harvest. The cadre and his team arrived and weighed the grain and loaded it and took it away, leaving behind an amount that the farmer understood with a sickening precision that no document ever captured was not enough to get his family through the winter. He couldn't leave. The internal passport system meant that peasants were legally bound to their communes. He couldn't appeal. The political atmosphere of the Great Leap made expressing doubt about the system equivalent to counter-revolutionary activity. He couldn't even, in the worst periods, glean from the fields after harvest because the fields belonged to the commune and gleaning was treated as theft of state property. So he did what humans do when the walls close in. He looked for anything. He stripped bark from trees and boiled it. He dug for roots. He ate the leather of old shoes. He fed his children clay mixed with water to fill their stomachs with something. He watched the clay come back out of them and understood that it hadn't worked, and he tried something else. Somewhere in Gansu province, in the winter of 1959, a man whose name does not appear in any document that has survived sat outside the door of his house in the cold and did not go back inside. His neighbors found him there the next morning. They were too weak to move him far, so they left him at the edge of the road.
3 days later, there was no one left in the house to notice he was still there.
The demographer Judith Bannister, working from Chinese census data in the 1980s, estimated the total death toll of the Great Leap Forward famine at somewhere between 30 and 55 million people. The historian Frank de Cotter, working from provincial archives that became partially accessible after the 1990s, argues for a figure toward the higher end of that range, and possibly beyond it. The Chinese government's official acknowledgement, issued cautiously and partially in the 1980s, described the period as containing serious losses caused by leftist errors. 30 to 55 million people. The spread between those numbers, a gap of 25 million human lives, is itself larger than most famines in history. We are that uncertain. We are uncertain by that much. In Anhui province alone, the province where Chen noticed the silence in the evenings, a study published decades later estimated that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the entire provincial population died during the famine years. In some counties, the death rate was higher than that. Villages lost half their population. The people who survived aged extraordinarily fast. The children who survived grew up shorter than they should have been, their bones telling the story their mouths were not permitted to tell. Through all of those years, all of those villages, all of those bodies at the edges of roads, the official position of the Chinese Communist Party was that the harvests were good, the people were fed, and the Great Leap Forward was succeeding. People inside the system knew the truth. One of them was Peng Dehuai, a general and a member of the Politburo, who traveled through the countryside in 1959 and saw what was happening and wrote a private letter to Mao saying that the Great Leap was causing catastrophic harm and needed to be corrected. He was careful, measured, respectful in tone. He was not submitting a dissent. He was writing as a colleague, as someone who believed the party could still correct course. Mao read the letter, had it distributed to the entire leadership as an example of counter-revolutionary thinking, stripped Peng of all his positions, and labeled him a traitor. The other members of the leadership, watching what happened to Peng Dehuai for telling the truth,
understood the lesson with absolute clarity. The famine continued for 3 more years. That silence, the silence of people inside the system who knew and could not speak, is its own kind of weapon. It is the mechanism by which a bureaucracy can collectively know something and collectively refuse to acknowledge knowing it, because the cost of acknowledgement falls entirely on whoever speaks first. It keeps the machinery running after anyone with a conscience has seen what the machinery does. The photographs came late. They came to Bengal first, in 1943, and those images moved through the world and created a kind of witnessing that the documentation inside the system had failed to produce. They came, in a different form, to Biafra in 1968, when the Nigerian government's blockade of the breakaway region produced a famine that killed somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. When Western journalists and aid workers finally got access and brought their cameras, the images that came out hit the Western public with a force that nothing had quite managed before. Skeletal children with distended abdomens, eyes too large for wasted faces, the specific, unmistakable morphology of severe malnutrition laid out on the front pages of newspapers in London and New York and Paris. Those images did something that surprised the governments that had been managing the crisis from a comfortable distance. They generated political pressure that was genuinely difficult to ignore. Donations flooded into aid organizations. Governments were asked, publicly and repeatedly, to explain their positions. The slow, imperfect, inadequate machinery of international response began to move. What nobody in power ever quite managed to fully process was this: the photographs were not showing anything new. The starvation they depicted had been going on for months before the cameras arrived. The bodies in the photographs were the end of a process that had begun in offices and meeting rooms, in policy decisions and logistical calculations, in the same architecture of dehumanization and administrative distance we've been tracing through every case in this story. The cameras didn't catch the crime. They caught the consequence, months after the crime had already run most of its course. What the cameras did, and this is what made them so powerful and so threatening to the systems that produced these famines, was collapse the administrative distance. The memos and the requisition forms and the export schedules all depended on a fundamental separation between the decision and its consequence, between the person signing the document and the person dying as a result of what the document set in motion. The photographs abolished that separation. They put the consequence in front of the decision-maker's face and refused to let it be filed away. A British colonial official in London could read a cable describing increased mortality in Bengal and process it as information. He could not look at a photograph of a Bengali mother sitting in a Calcutta gutter beside her dead child and process it the same way. The photograph demanded a different kind of response, not an administrative one, but a human one. The entire architecture of managed starvation depended on the human response being kept at bay. This is why governments that use hunger as a tool have, historically, also worked so hard to control information. The Soviet Union expelled or pressured foreign journalists during the Ukrainian famine and maintained for decades that the famine had not occurred. China kept its provincial archives closed for 30 years after the Great Leap. The Nigerian government during Biafra tried to restrict journalist access and frame the starvation as enemy propaganda. The Ethiopian government, under the Derg in the 1980s, which managed a famine that killed somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million people, while simultaneously pursuing a forced resettlement program that made the famine dramatically worse, initially refused international aid and denied the scale of the crisis, relenting only when the pressure from outside became impossible to manage. The pattern is so consistent, it becomes almost predictable. Famine as policy, followed immediately by the suppression of evidence that famine is occurring.
The two things travel together, always, because they have to. You cannot maintain the apparatus of starvation and simultaneously allow the gap between the policy and its consequences to be visible. The visibility is the threat. The cameras are the enemy. The cameras kept coming. Something kept breaking through the censorship, through the official denials, through the administrative language that turned mass death into statistical deviation. The photographs from Bengal, the survivor testimonies from Ukraine, gathered quietly and painstakingly by researchers over decades, and eventually forming the evidentiary core of recognition proceedings in parliaments around the world. The provincial archive documents from China that researchers began accessing in the 90s and that transformed our understanding of the Great Leap's true scale. The satellite images and intercept intelligence and aid worker testimony from more recent famines, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, where the pattern is still running, recognizably in our own time. Something survives all of it, something that outlasts the famine itself, and the policy that created it, and the government that implemented the policy, and sometimes the government that succeeded that government, and sometimes several more governments after that. It is not quite memory, because memory fades and gets distorted and gets suppressed and gets replaced. It is something harder than memory and more stubborn. Call it the shape of what happened. The Irish diaspora in America does not need to know the specific details of the Corn Laws or Charles Trevelyan's theories about market economics to carry something in its bones, some orientation toward the state's power over food, some instinct about what it means when a government decides whose hunger matters and whose doesn't. That shape got transmitted, not through documents, not through formal history lessons, but through the stories that survived the ocean crossing, through the particular quality of precariousness that gets passed down in families who know, somewhere below the level of articulation, that plenty is not guaranteed, and that the people in charge of the granary are not necessarily the people in charge of your welfare. The children who survived the Ukrainian famine, the ones who were young enough in 1932 and 33 that they grew up with those years as a foundational memory rather than a later trauma, carried a specific relationship to food for the rest of their lives. Documented accounts describe elderly Ukrainians decades later who could not throw away bread, not a crust, not a crumb, who kept small hoards of food hidden in their homes, not because they were hungry, but because some part of them that could not be reached by logic or time or plenty refused to trust that the hunger would not come back. That refusal is not irrational. It is the body's faithful record of what the system did. The shape of what happened does not require a government to acknowledge it. It does not require a historical commission or a formal recognition process or a museum. It lives in the behavior of survivors and the behavior of their children, and sometimes the behavior of their children's children, in the particular ways they relate to food and land and the state's authority over both. It lives in the political formations that emerge from traumatized populations, the specific textures of Irish-American political identity, the Ukrainian national consciousness that crystallized partly around the memory of those years, the deep distrust of central authority that runs through Chinese rural culture even today. The weapon, once used, does not simply stop. The famine ends. The hunger ends for those who survive it. The knowledge of what was done does not have an end. It moves through time in the bodies and the politics and the cultures of the people it touched, looking for the moment when it can be named, when the shape of it can finally be traced from its true beginning to its true end. We are still in that moment. We are still doing that tracing. The granaries are still there. The trains still run. Somewhere, right now, someone in an office with a desk and a stamp is looking at a column of numbers and making a calculation about which population's hunger is, in the current configuration of power and interest and ideology, an acceptable cost. The question, the only question that matters, the one that runs beneath every case we've examined and every case we haven't, is not whether that person exists. It's whether the cameras get there in time.